So I've just about had enough of work for the day, but I did have one more story to tell you, which I found rather interesting. So a lady had 150 packages delivered to her from Amazon. And at first she thought it was some kind of joke. She thought someone was like emptying warehouse stock or something and delivering it to her doorstep. But when she looked into them, there were actually some really valuable stuff in there. So she decided to keep it. But there's one important thing that she did first, which was to contact Amazon. Because you might let me know in the comments below what you would do if you had 150 boxes delivered to your doorstep without asking for them, just completely unsolicited, landed on your doorstep, all the same thing inside, I might add, all of some reasonable value. Now, you might think that you can just keep them and think nothing more of it. However, if it turns out that they've been sent to you by complete error, and you decide to keep them and just say nothing to anyone about it, but then the original seller or perhaps even Amazon come asking you for the goods, or at worst report it to the police and say that you've dishonestly kept these things, you might think that you can just keep them, but in fact you may well be accused of theft. In fact, you might be charged with theft, because the dishonest element of retaining something that was clearly never intended for you, and with just a small amount of diligence, you can find out where it came from and who it should go back to. That's exactly what you should do instead of keeping it, because by keeping it, you may well be committing an act of theft, because that is inherently dishonest. And with the latest, newest test for dishonesty, that being in Ivy and Genting casinos, which is if generally society considers this to be a dishonest act, then it's generally going to be a dishonest act. Because this overturned the original test for dishonesty, which was in place for decades, which was that it had to be a two-stage test. Both if the jury objectively, as in an ordinary, reasonable, honest person, thought it was dishonest, and then went on to decide whether or not the defendant considered that to be dishonest. In the latter case, Genting casinos decided that actually there were serious problems with that first test, because as a society we shouldn't really be lowering our standards to what the defendant thinks was honest and reasonable. The latter case was actually a really interesting case, because it was a professional card player who was using some fancy kind of edge sorting process with the cards in the deck, and with some exchange with the croupier, and it was able to arrange them in such a way to give him an advantage. Now, obviously, he won out a lot of money from the casino, but they refused to pay him, and that's what the case was about. But ultimately, it was decided that the act was inherently dishonest, because society as a whole would probably think that's dishonest. But considering the original test for dishonesty, it probably wouldn't have been, because he maintained that it was honest. But the court said there were serious issues with that test, and thus overturning that test for dishonesty in 2017. So this lady with her Amazon boxes, she knew exactly where they came from. She really should just contact Amazon, as she did. And in fact, they said to keep them, at which point, obviously, that made it okay. So if you get something that really wasn't intended for you, you really should think about whether or not with a little bit of diligence you can find out where it came from and who it should go back to. Because if you decide to keep it, that might well be dishonest. You might well be facing an arrest and charge of theft. So I hope you found that interesting. Please like and subscribe. I'll see you next time.